Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the first technical webinar on revenue statistics in Africa, which has been co-organised by the African Union Commission, the African Tax Administration Forum and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. My name is Michelle Harding. I'm the head of the Tax Data and Statistical Analysis Unit at the OECD Centre for Tax Policy and Administration. Earlier this year, we had the ambition of organising a technical workshop in Africa, as we've done in the past on several occasions in Pretoria, in Rabat, in Addis Ababa, and in Nairobi. But unfortunately, the current environment and the current travel restrictions do not allow us to organise a meeting in person. However, I hope that having a webinar like this one can give us an opportunity to meet at least virtually and to exchange with each other until we're all able to meet in person again. Before we get started, a few logistical comments about the webinar format. Firstly, I invite you to send in questions at any time during the presentations, during the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. There's no need to wait until the end of the presentations to submit questions. We'll address these questions either in writing as we go or in comments at the end of the meeting in the discussion section. Also, for internal purposes, this meeting is being recorded. We plan to make the recording available in a web page after the event. We also plan to make the presentations that you will see available in the web page, and we'll send you the link to this web page and to the other revenue statistics in Africa material after the webinar. The goal of this webinar is to provide an opportunity for African countries and for revenue statistics in Africa partners to discuss current and future trends in domestic resource mobilization in Africa. The discussion today is based on data and analysis from revenue statistics in Africa, as well as on recent work by ATAF, the African Union and the OECD on the COVID-19 crisis. Revenue statistics in Africa provides harmonized, comparable and reliable data on public revenue and on taxes in particular. And the information in revenue statistics is critical for fiscal policy and for reform, as well as for international dialogue and cooperation around domestic resource mobilization. And this is a priority for African countries and a key focus of the first 10-year implementation plan of the African Union's Agenda 2063. In addition, revenue statistics in Africa also advances the implementation of the African Union's strategy for the harmonization of statistics in Africa and the Pan-African Statistics Programme. The Revenue Statistics in Africa initiative is a collaboration between ATAF, the African Union, the OECD Centre for Tax Policy and Administration, and the OECD Development Centre. And we're grateful for the support of the African Development Bank, ATAF, and the World Customs Organizations. In addition, I'd like to thank in particular the development partners who support the initiative. These are the governments of Ireland, Japan, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, as well as the European Union. The Revenue Statistics in Africa initiative covers a growing number of countries, and the 2019 edition, which we're speaking about today, covers 26 countries. We will further expand this year and in the years to come. We have the pleasure to count among the attendees today focal points from many of the countries already participating in revenue statistics in Africa, officials from countries that have participated in our technical workshops in the past, officials from national statistical offices across Africa, representatives from the regional economic communities, and our partner organizations and development partners in revenue statistics in Africa. We're also hosting a second webinar tomorrow, which will take place in French, and we have a number of other countries registered for the French-speaking event. As I mentioned, Revenue Statistics in Africa is a collaboration between the African Union, ATAF, and the OECD. So to open the event, I would like to ask representatives from each of these organizations to make opening remarks. I will give the floor first to Yeo Desina, the Head of Economic Policy and Research at the Department of Economic Affairs in the African Union. Thank you, Desina. Okay, I propose we take a few moments to try and work out the connection at Dulcina's end, and we'll come back to opening remarks by the African Union later in the panel. So I will pass over now to make opening remarks on behalf of ATAF to Nara Munkim, who's the Director of Research at ATAF.
So thank you very much, Michelle, and greetings to everyone. And I will actually not even attempt to share my video because the internet is quite unstable here on my side in Pretoria. So apologies for that. So thank you very much, and greetings to all the partners at the African Union and the OECD, as well as all the representative of our membership African Tax Administration in Africa, especially those officials in research, statistics, and plannings in the tax administration on the continent. So greetings to you all and welcome to this technical webinar. So as we all know, data collections is a prerequisite for revenue collections in Africa. Unfortunately, some of our tax administration data and data analysis sometimes do not have the importance that it should have. So the importance of data collection and especially revenue statistics in Africa cannot be overemphasized, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. Tax administrations on the continents, they generate a considerable body of data that stem from all variety of tax statements and returns in all categories of taxes and duties. Unfortunately, such data sometimes is collected and underutilized in our tax administrations. Statistics and analysis, they are a combination of our condition for better policy formulation and fiscal planning. Indeed, without them, there can be neither efficient policy nor reforms in our tax administrations. For example, relevant and accurate and reliable statistics are critical to risk profiling and identification in tax administration. And without statistics, tax authority cannot address or reduce non-compliance. In addition, during this COVID-19 pandemic, is absolutely critical that we are able to analyze and better evaluate impacts for our decision making, to recalibrate where needs to be, as well as increase preparedness in case of future crisis. And for that, data and data analysis is again very, very important. So since 2015, when ATAF, the African Union Commission, and OECD started working to prepare the first edition of the revenue statistic in Africa, we all have recognized the benefit of harmonizing the data reporting requirements for various international institutions while preserving our respective comparative advantages, not only to avoid duplication of efforts, but also to reduce the burden on countries of reporting the same data to multiple organizations. So we have started a little bit in this regard, and through both the revenue statistics in Africa and the African Tax Outlook publication, we have made attempt to achieve just that. So those two publications, as most of you know, because you are part of both projects, you are the focal points of both projects. They tend to be complementary in the sense that they represent a significant step towards enhancing the comparability, the quality, and the accessibility of public revenue data on the continent, but also around the world. But in addition, the ATO annual publication focused more on tailored revenue and administrative data, as well as custom data aimed at gauging the performance of tax administration and making policy recommendations at improving tax systems. So it provides practical solutions and challenges highlighted by the data, and also allow for a sharing of good practices. So going forward is very important for the partners that we should aim to accelerate the process of harmonizing revenue data in Africa under the leadership of the regional, African regional organizations, so that we, again, like I said earlier, we reduce the burden as much as possible. And where possible, the methodologies of data collection should be aligned while respecting the individual countries' reporting requirement. So basically, that's what I wanted to say for now in terms of introductory remark, and I wish us all very fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Nara. So now I will give the floor to David Bradbury, Head of the Tax Policy and Statistics Division at the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration, to make opening remarks on behalf of the OECD. Thanks, David.
Well, thanks very much, Michelle, and it's a great privilege to be with you all. Unfortunately, it's a virtual engagement today. We don't have the opportunity to come together in person. These are extraordinary times, and I guess it's in that context that we have organised the event virtually. But the show must go on, and that's why we are doing so. And it is great to have the participation of so many of you. I extend a very warm welcome to all of our contact points. But of course, I'm delighted to be sharing these opening remarks with a couple of colleagues from partner organisations. In particular, we saw Yao Decina, and we will see a little more of him a little bit later, we hope, if the internet does assist him in that regard. I'd also like to acknowledge Nara Munkham from ATAF. Both the AUC Commission and ATAF have been great partners, and without that great strength of partnership that we've had, none of the great advances that have been made in terms of statistics in the region would have been achieved the way they have. So I thank you all for your contributions, and I thank also all of our contact focal points for the work that they do. Now, it is worth, I think, just reflecting upon some of the progress that has been made. And when we think of the initial effort to pull together the first edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa, and we look at what we have now been able to achieve, we've really, in a period of 4 years, gone from 8 countries to 30 countries. So that is almost a fourfold increase in that time. Now, at a time when everyone's talking about all of the productivity benefits that come from working from home, I think it is worth reflecting on the very high levels of productivity that we've all been engaged in. And of course, that level of country coverage could not have been achieved without the contributions of everyone, the partners, but indeed the countries themselves. And we know that we are working collectively to build something that is important and will underpin better policy direction in the future. And of course, whilst we meet virtually today, we know that there have been many important meetings that have occurred in person in the past, whether it be in Addis, Nairobi, Rabat, and Pretoria. And we certainly look forward to the next meeting, hopefully being one that will also be in person. I think it is important to not just acknowledge the partners, the focal points, the countries, but special acknowledgement needs to go to all of those development partners that have assisted in making this initiative possible through their generous financial support. In particular, I wish to acknowledge Ireland, Japan, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and of course the European Union, who have been playing a very important role over many years with this project. Now, the focus of the discussion today will be around domestic resource mobilisation. And this is a term that we hear bandied around a lot. I think that it's always of critical importance to countries in the region, but I think it is of particular importance as we tackle and confront the challenges of COVID-19. Not just in terms of the immediate policy responses, but I think certainly in terms of the longer term policy responses, we need to be very mindful of the central role that domestic resource mobilisation will play in strengthening the resilience of all of our countries. And I think that this is where, as we move through this crisis, and we all hope that we pass through it quickly and with as little harm and damage as possible, but we do so knowing that as we begin to look towards what may await us on the other side of this crisis, that we will be able to confront a very challenging, a very complex policy environment with a baseline set of statistics and data that is vastly improved on what we have been able to deal with before. And that is of crucial significance because good policy at its heart must be underpinned by good data and good statistics, both in terms of the overall tax to GDP ratio, which gives us a really strong sense of the overall levels of domestic resource mobilisation that have been achieved or may need to be achieved in the future, but also important information about the tax structure, which tells us so much about the extent to which certain taxes are being deployed and mobilized, and the extent to which others may need to be called upon in the future. Now, I think all countries, regardless of their starting point in terms of tax to GDP ratio or development, are looking and going into this crisis with an acknowledgement that the health considerations of our populations are first and foremost. As we confront those and hopefully deal with them quickly, the task ahead as we rebuild out the back end of this crisis and into the future will be to stimulate recovery in our economies, and then to do so in a way over the longer term that allows us to mobilise the domestic resources necessary in order to fund the public goods and services that our populations require. That's an enormous challenge. It's one that we all dedicate ourselves to, and the work that you are all doing in improving the baseline quality of comparable statistics that is available in the region is an absolutely critical part of that overall effort. So I want to acknowledge all of your collective efforts. It is a great privilege to be with you today. I look forward to hearing more of the outcomes of the workshop, and of course, stay in touch, and most importantly, stay safe so that we all have the opportunity to meet again in person in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much, David. And I will now give the floor back to Yayo Dosina, Head of the Economic Policy and Research Division from the African Union, to make opening remarks on behalf of the African Union.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I think I already thank you guys to find our own development, because domestic resources is more adequate, predictable, sustainable, and more integrated financial mechanism will really help us to achieve that objective and mobilize resources to finance Agenda 2063. And to achieve this, as I mentioned, we know that last year report showed that the tax over GDP ratio is almost 17%. It's very low, and some countries even 6%, like Nigeria, which is our biggest economy. So we think that as AU, working with you, we'll need to work take our stand and our political role to really encourage member states. And this is where we our comparative advantages than the ATAF and the OECD. As a political organization, we really want to create that awareness at the higher political level, keep discussion at high level with member state at the policymaker level, mobilization at the top of the agenda. And we have to mobilize partners like OECD, ATAF, to make sure that in other partner, we really support countries in this endeavor. So we really count on you as partner, and we count on the tax administration within countries. You are not alone. As partner, we really want to support you and build your capacity, even if we don't have much capacity in AUC, but we believe that putting all our effort together with partner, we'll be able to support countries wherever the capacity building needs are. So I will not be long because we already lost 25 minutes. Let me stop there. So AUC will not spare no effort to work with policy decision makers and tax administration for our member state, a development partner, to ensure that sustainable financing is mobilizing for Africa development agenda. So let me stop here, and then we'll proceed for the other session of the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dosina. We had a few technical problems throughout, but we heard most of it. So thank you very much for those remarks. So now I will turn to the first presentation on the agenda, which is on trends over time in domestic resource mobilization in Africa. And I will hand over the floor to Emmanuel Modica and Leonie Sedano from the Revenue Statistics team at the OECD on the basis of the last edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa. Thank you, Emmanuel and Leonie.
Thanks, Michelle. Yes, hi everyone. I'm very glad to be here. So I will start the presentation, and then Leonie will take over after that. So, so as we mentioned, Revenue Statistics in Africa is a joint initiative between ATAF, the African Union, and the OECD, and we have also the technical support of the African Development Bank, CREDAF, and the World Customs Organization. And we are really grateful to the development partners who do support and make Revenue Statistics in Africa initiative possible. And these are the governments, as David mentioned, of Ireland, Japan, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, and as well as the European Union. Next, please. Okay, so this slide, that was mentioned a bit before also. The 2019 edition covers 26 countries, and it's about 3/4 of Africa's GDP. And the 2019 edition includes for the first time Equatorial Guinea, Madagascar, Mauritania, Nigeria, and the Seychelles. And for the next edition, we have at least 30 countries. So what does the report give us? It provides an overview of the main taxation trends in the region, in both the level and the composition of taxation between 1990 and 2017. We have also an average for the 26 African countries, and we compare it to the Latin American Caribbean region, LAC, and the OECD average. So the report has very critical information on tax system in the region and their revenue in recent years. Even if we do not cover the period up to 2020, where we have the pandemic, the report provides an important backdrop to understand the fiscal capacity of the region to respond to the COVID crisis. And it's a starting point for considering the impact of COVID-19 on public revenues. Next, please. Next. Yeah, thank you. So what you've got here is the tax to GDP ratio in the 26 African countries in 2017, as well as the 3 averages. So we have the Africa average stood at 17.2 of GDP in 2017. And this is lower than the LAC average, which is at 22.8% of GDP, and the OECD average at 34.2% of GDP in 2017. And what we see here as well, it's a very wide variation across the countries. So as Dosina has mentioned, from 5.7 of GDP in Nigeria to 31.5% of GDP in the Seychelles. Next, please. Next. Yeah, thank you. So here you've got the tax to GDP ratio as well for 2017, but worldwide and for the 4 regions. And also in 2017, you can see there is a high variation of tax to GDP ratio also in the other regions. We've got 60 countries out of the 100 countries in the database who have a ratio about 20% of GDP. And in Africa, this is the case of 6 countries out of 26. Next, please. So here you've got the change of tax to GDP ratio between 2016 and 2017 for the African countries and the averages. And the Africa average has stayed unchanged. It remains at 17.2. And this for the third consecutive year. We saw tax to GDP ratio increased in 15 of the countries of the publication, decreased in 10, and remained unchanged in 1 country between 2016 and 17. You can see that the country, the most on the right, The Republic of the Congo had the largest decrease in the tax to GDP ratio in 2017. It's a decrease of 3.4 percentage points, and it's affecting all the main tax categories. This can be attributable to the continuing economic recession in the country, but also some new hydrocarbons regulations that were introduced in 2016 to attract new international oil companies and provide more generous fiscal and customer regimes. On the other side, on the left, you can see that in Egypt, the tax to GDP ratio increased by 1.8 percentage point between 2016 and 17, and that's mainly driven by an increase in VAT revenue. And Egypt did an extensive VAT reforms in 2017, which expanded the VAT base, reduced exemption, and increased the standard VAT rate. Next, please. So here you see the evolution of the tax to GDP ratio for the three average between 2000 and 2017, as well as the trend for the non-tax revenue. Between what we can say is between 2010 and 2017, the tax revenue in Africa increased by 1.9 percentage points on average. And this is very similar to the other region. In LAC, it was 1.7 percentage point, and the OECD was 1.9 percentage point. But the increase in the tax revenue was offset by a decline in non-tax revenue that went from 7.5% of GDP in 2010 to 5.7% in 2017. Next, please, next slide. Here, this slide shows the tax structure by the main type of taxes for the three average and for the African countries. So the group of countries that are on the left and those in the middle rely principally on taxes on goods and services, whereas the countries on the right rely principally on income tax. So when we come back to the group on the left, they have a higher VAT revenue share than the share from a revenue from other tax on goods and services such as excise, custom duties, export. Whether this is the reverse for the group of countries in the middle, so they have a VAT revenue share which is inferior to the share of revenue from other taxes on goods and services. But what we can say is that the African economies, the African economies rely heavily on tax on goods and services. This is about 53.7% of total tax revenue on average. And VAT alone accounted for 29.4% of total tax revenue. CIT is also a very important source of tax revenue in Africa, and at 18.6% of total tax, it's a higher proportion than in LAC and the OECD. Now, the tax structure has evolved, for the last decade, and the share of VAT, the share of PIT has increased relative to 2008, but PIT and social security contribution remain still quite low in Africa compared to other regions. Next, please. Here you've got the slide show the level of environmental related tax revenue as percentage of GDP split by 4 types of sources of the tax. So the energy, transport, resource, and pollution. So it's on average, revenue from environmental related taxes amounted to 1.3% of GDP in 2017. This is lower than the OECD at 2.3, but higher than the LAC average of 1.1% of GDP. And again, here you've got a very wide variation across countries where we see that Côte d'Ivoire has 0.2% of GDP of environmental related tax revenue, and the Seychelles, this amounted to 4.4% of GDP. What we can say also, it's the revenue from energy products amounted to about 2/3 of environmental related tax revenue on average. And the revenue from motor vehicle and the transport taxes represented most of the remainder. Whereas the tax revenue from the other environmental related bases are negligible. And actually this is very similar to the breakdown of this revenue for the LAC and OECD countries. I'll pass over now to Leonie.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Next slide, please. So I'm going to continue talking about non-tax revenues in Africa, and they've ranged from 0.5% of GDP in South Africa to 18.7% of GDP for Botswana in 2017. Generally, you can say that tax revenues are higher than non-tax revenues in almost all countries, with the exception of Botswana, Congo, and the Equatorial Guinea. And you can see that on the graph, where we show the horizontally, you can see the total tax revenue on the horizontal line, and on the vertical, total non-tax revenues. And so the three countries that are above the 45-degree line have higher non-tax revenues than tax revenues. In Botswana, the Southern African Custom Union revenues represent the majority of non-tax revenues, whereas rents and royalties, in particular oil, represent the majority of non-tax revenues in the Republic of the Congo and Equatorial Guinea. Next, please. On here, well, revenue statistics in Africa provides an important backdrop to analyze the COVID-19 impact on domestic resource mobilization in Africa. And you can actually see that in two ways. Firstly, revenue statistics in Africa provide information on the state of play of revenue mobilization in Africa going into the COVID-19 crisis, as we provide data on tax structures and level. And to have this data will help to analyze the impact from COVID-19. And secondly, we can also gain some insights from our historic data on the impact of earlier economic shocks on revenues. However, we need to say that the COVID shock is something completely different than the economic shocks in the past. However, we can look at the revenue development during the global financial crisis from 2008 to 2009. And thus, this slide here shows the changes in tax and non-tax revenues as percentage of GDP between 2008 and 2010 for African economies and the Africa average. And tax revenue on average in Africa decreased during this period by 0.3 percentage points, and more than half the African countries have shown decreases in tax revenues that were larger than 2 percentage points. So that they've shown decreases, and several have shown decreases larger than 2 percentage points, and that were Cabo Verde, Madagascar, South Africa, and Morocco. And the decreases mainly occurred because of decreases in corporate income taxes and VAT. And corporate income taxes decreased mostly by more than 1 percentage point in South Africa, Morocco, and Côte d'Ivoire. And value-added taxes decreased by more than 1 percentage point in Cabo Verde and Madagascar. However, you can see that non-tax revenues have decreased on average by 1.8 percentage point. So non-tax revenues are always a lot more volatile than tax revenues, and this is particularly visible during crises. And the volatility of non-tax revenues greatly depend on the structure of these revenues. So the falls in non-tax revenue occurred principally in rents and royalties, but also in revenues from the Southern African Custom Union in Eswatini and Botswana. The largest falls, however, were seen in countries with high reliance on rents and royalties, so on oil rents and royalties in the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Cameroon. And in Africa, as it's true around the world, levels of tax revenues are closely linked to economic growth, and they do tend to fall faster than GDP in times of crisis. And while it's still relatively early to say too much about the changes in GDP due to COVID, we do see significant falls in many countries. So this also gives an indication that COVID-19 does have the potential to set back revenue collection in Africa in the short run. Next slide, please. The amplitude of non-tax revenues varies across countries, and so does their structure. So the structure of non-tax revenues can be divided into three main groups. 10 countries receive most of the non-tax revenues from grants, and those are also the countries with the lowest GDP per capita. 7 countries receive more revenues from rents and royalties, and the rest receives revenues from other revenues, such as already mentioned, Botswana and Eswatini, where they receive a lot of non-tax revenue from SACU. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. As already mentioned, non-tax revenues are highly volatile over time. And here you can see 3 examples. So regardless of their structure, you can see the example of Burkina Faso, where most of the non-tax revenue comes from grants, Equatorial Guinea that receives a lot of oil revenues, and Botswana that receives a lot of SACU revenues. And here you can see the variety of the non-tax structure, but you can also see that all of them are volatile regardless of the structure. And another thing the 3 have in common, that non-tax revenues have been declining in all 3 countries, and this is also true across other African countries. Yeah, so next slide, please. Okay, so just to sum up the short presentation we did on the main findings, what you should take away from this presentation is that tax revenues have reached a plateau in Africa. On average, the Africa 26 average is 17.2% for the 3rd consecutive year in 2017. Tax to GDP ratios, nevertheless, were quite varied a lot, so like between 5.7% of GDP in Nigeria to 31.5% in the Seychelles in 2017. And taxes on goods and services are the principal source of revenue for most of the African countries, as they account for half of total tax revenue. And VAT revenues account for 29.4% on average in Africa. By contrast, revenues from personal and income taxes and social security contributions are comparatively low, and in comparison with other regions such as the OECD or the LAC. Environmentally related taxes are increasing in Africa, but there's scope to use them even further. Non-tax revenues have continued to decline over the years, and they were lower than tax revenues in all but 3 of the 26 countries. And the global financial crisis shows that the COVID-19 crisis does have the potential to set back domestic resource mobilization in Africa, particularly if the falls in rents and royalties are repeated. So thank you very much, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel and Leonie, for the presentation on the findings from the last edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa. I will now pass over to a series of commentators from the African Union, from ATAF and the OECD, who will provide comments on factors likely to affect the future of domestic resource mobilization in Africa. Before we turn to these presentations, I remind participants that at the end of the comments, there will be a question and answer section. So I encourage you to send questions via that function at any time throughout the presentations. I will now give the floor to Ndenai Charumbira from the African Union, who will discuss the impact of the coronavirus pandemic in Africa and the channels of impact on revenues in Africa.
Right, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Emmanuel and Leonie, for the presentation. It set the ball rolling. Okay, can you see my screen? Right, yes, I've been asked to speak on the impact of COVID-19 on African economies, and the channels of the impact on revenues. So how many minutes do I have? I suppose it's 10?
Around that, yes.
Okay. So I'll provide a brief introduction. I'll speak to the socio-economic impact, and then the impact on revenues, and then I'll provide some policy recommendations. So just to start and put the impact on economies in context, we already know that the COVID-19 pandemic is public health and economic crisis. It's a dual crisis, and that is negatively affecting African countries like all other countries in the world. Before the crisis, Africa was set to grow at around, it was 3.4% in 2019. It was projected to grow at 3.9% in 2020 and to increase to 4.1% in 2021. That's GDP growth. And these are projections from the African Development Bank. Before, there was a decade where Africa was growing at a very impressive rate, but after 2014, there was this drop in commodity prices that affected GDP growth, but growth was still positive. Now, COVID-19 has reversed these gains that have been made, and we see projections now indicating that growth will be in the negative for this year 2020, possibly for a few, maybe next year too. And the consensus is that Africa is going to go into recession for the first time in 25 years. This has been due to the decline in commodity prices. As you can see, from the 1990s, commodity prices were rising, and then there was that drop during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and commodity prices were rising again. We can also see that drop that I was talking about of 2014, and there was a rise. Now they are falling again due to the crisis. Oil prices have particularly been most affected. So the socio-economic impact that we saw from COVID-19 was that there were lockdown measures across the continent that were aimed at mitigating and containing the virus. And these negatively impacted particularly the travel and tourism sectors. There was a complete shutdown of some borders, and people could not travel anymore. Tourism could not receive the visitors that it used to. And these shutdowns led to major losses to businesses, resulting in rising unemployment and reduced tax receipts. So unemployment and poverty are also said to continue to decline due to the impact of this extreme social distancing, and it's particularly very bad for the informal sector, which is about 70% in most African countries. We also saw the fiscal space continue to shrink. It's still shrinking as some countries try to provide stimulus packages to assist the most vulnerable in society and to respond to the health crisis. Debt and borrowing are also on the rise. Debt was already rising prior to the crisis, but now we see it might have a very negative impact in future unless some measures are taken to assist African countries that are facing a debt crisis. We also have a problem of food insecurity and malnutrition, and it has worsened during the crisis. People who are living in conflict areas are mostly affected, and they're suffering devastating effects from the COVID-19 pandemic. Another impact is on schools that were closed during the lockdowns. Some schools remain closed, and remote learning is not available for everybody, particularly in the rural areas where we don't have internet connection, or very poor internet connection if it's available. So I'll turn now to the impact on revenues. There's been a loss of revenues both from domestic and external sources. Due to the commodity price decline, the oil prices have been declining since 2015. Due to that decline, the demand for commodities has declined, and therefore resource revenues have declined. That also has an impact on tax revenues, as corporate and personal income taxes have fallen as a result of losses to businesses. Private savings and portfolio inflows were also on the decline. The IMF was suggesting that they had seen the largest capital outflows out of Africa ever. We also saw revenues from travel and tourism reduced with border closures. And FDI also declined, because FDI to Africa is mostly resource seeking. And with the fall in commodity prices, FDI has declined. So remittances as another channel through which we have seen lost revenues, as unemployment in the host countries, the USA and Europe, unemployment was rising, and therefore remittances to the continent reduced, particularly during the pandemic. And ODA is also expected to fall. It has been falling in the past and is expected to fall further as partner countries or donor countries are severely affected by the pandemic. We have also seen that this situation impacts data collection procedures differently, and each of them requires a different response. Particularly the impact of the pandemic on administrative data is different from censuses and surveys. So the production of administrative data and register statistics may continue, but with limited functionalities, because some people were asked to work from home, they had to reduce contact. But there are many ways in which quality of such data can be undermined. There could be underreporting and misclassification in registering events and activities. And this is a result of the lockdown measures, again, as mobility is reduced. So data custodians and the national statistical offices, who are the coordinators of statistical systems, will need to tighten quality checks and regularly assess and transparently communicate the quality of admin data and registers. They have to communicate that to users of statistics. I will now provide some policy recommendations. During the pandemic, the governments used fiscal and monetary policies. These were very instrumental in tackling the adverse effects of the pandemic on African economies and on the livelihoods of their most vulnerable. And what we want to suggest is that post-pandemic, private sector investments will be crucial in paving the way to economic recovery. So we are going to need foreign direct investment, portfolio equity and loans, and donors and partners should be in a position to help African countries mobilize resources so that the private sector is well equipped to aid in the economic recovery process. We have suggested some policy recommendations in 3 phases. For the emergency response, we think that governments should incentivize companies to convert their businesses to manufacturing medical supplies. And such incentives, unfortunately, would have to probably involve waiving tax payments for the period that they're providing this. Of course, it will have a negative impact on tax revenues, but also it will assist in curbing the pandemic, which would be useful for the future. We also suggest that governments should provide relief funding for companies in travel and tourism and to their most strategic state-owned enterprises so that jobs are not lost on a very large scale. In the recovery phase, the medium term, governments should also extend tax relief to stimulate business activity after the lockdown and provide liquidity and stimulus to the private sector, also to preserve jobs and livelihoods. And I mean, this will also help in tax revenues if jobs are not lost. And there should also be incentives for investments in industrialization and innovation, particularly digital innovation. We also think that the central banks have a role to play in the development agenda, lowering rates so as to loosen credit and provide guarantee funds so that private banks can provide more funding. So for statistics, it's an unprecedented time, we agree. So there's need to harness big data for the production of real-time official statistics, and some assistance from partners would be required in that regard. My apologies. For the long term, governments should create a conducive environment for the private sector so that they are able to develop the digital infrastructure. I think we all agree that we are going towards that era in which the digital infrastructure will be instrumental in providing jobs and ensuring growth. Governments should also facilitate capital markets development and should attract long-term investments to facilitate and sustain productive transformation. This will help in generating future revenues if we have companies that are able to hire people, we have jobs, and people will pay taxes. So also governments should facilitate and support the formalization and growth of micro, small, and medium enterprises, especially through access to financial services, so that they're able to provide the necessary jobs and generate the revenue that we require. And yes, it's COVID-19, it will pass, but the choices that we make today will change our lives for decades to come. I wish to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ndanae, for that presentation and for that conclusion, which is quite striking and very true. It's a good reminder to us of the importance of what we're doing, even if the COVID storm passes relatively quickly in the scheme of things. So now I will give the floor to Ezra Madzivanyuka, who's the research manager from ATAF, who will present recent work that ATAF has done on tax administration and policy developments in response to the coronavirus pandemic in Africa. Thank you, Ezra.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Let me just share my screen. I hope we are seeing it. Okay, thank you. So basically, you see that some of the issues that were highlighted by Denai converge with what we have in this presentation also. The outline of this presentation, I'll start with the introduction. Briefly, I'll look at the cue from pandemics. Then I'll mention about the ATAF survey that we conducted on our member countries, the conclusion, and the policy recommendations. So basically, yes, it's true, COVID-19 is threatening the African taxation landscape. In fact, it has affected the whole globe. And we looked at our major tax types. Basically, as ATAF countries, we have these major tax types which give us more revenue: value-added tax, personal income tax, corporate income tax, import duties, and excise duties. All these tax types have been affected by the pandemic. For example, VAT, we know it's a consumption tax. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, consumption of vatable goods is drastically reduced due to the lockdown, due to the failure of people to have adequate resources. So this has consequently also affected the revenue inflow. Even if you look at VAT on imports, it has already been affected because of the lockdown. The borders were closed. Most of the goods that were coming were COVID-related, and they were under relief. So there's no revenue, much revenue that we're expecting from this tax type, which has been a major tax types for our African member countries. Personal income tax, we know, pays one of the major components of PIT. It has also been severely eroded. Some countries have retrenched, others have asked the workers to work from home, but at a reduced pay. Quite a number of challenges have been faced by the companies. So this has also resulted in a fall in these tax types. Mention even CIT. CIT depends on profitability of companies. So which companies are expecting to make profit under the prevailing circumstances? Very few. So we will see that basically there's gonna be a reduction in tax revenue, especially on the major tax types. So as ATAF, we carried out 3 surveys on our members. One was related to the responses in view of the pandemic. The other one was in relation to the customs duty. Then the third one was related to business continuity. We have mentioned some of the issues in the previous webinars that we have had with the OECD, and we have also promised that we were working on a report which is now almost out. The report is entitled Tax Administration and Policy Development's Response to the Coronavirus Pandemic. What do we learn from the past pandemics and even the current pandemic? We have the Spanish flu of 1918, which resulted also in quite a number of challenges worldwide. It also resulted in shortage of labor as it affected mainly the labor force ages between 14 and 45. And that flu, the challenge from economists is that they say it's difficult to quantify its impact because it coincided with the World War, or the First World War. So you can't really measure the impact of the flu on its own because it came at a time also when the world was having another challenge from the effects of the World War. But it killed so many people due to the delays in the policymakers to especially impose the restrictions. We have Ebola that affected the African region, mostly affecting countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, and we almost about 2 billion or 12% of their combined GDP was lost out as a result of this Ebola pandemic. We have now the challenge for tax administrations. This is what we call the twin challenge. There is this imperative to collect revenue, but yet also there is this pressing need to implement relief measures. So the tax administrations are faced with a dilemma relating to this, because government is expecting also them to provide a relief, but at the same time is expecting also them to raise revenue. So these are the surveys I was talking about. I think I've already mentioned about the surveys that we carried. There were 3. The first one was on tax-related and non-tax-related relief measures provided by countries. We had 23 country responses in this survey. The second one was on customs revenue, where 18 countries responded. And the third survey was on business continuity, where we had responses from our 17 member countries. Briefly, I will just present the results of the survey. So, from the tax relief measures, these are basically what we see from our African country. Basically, the main tax type that was given more relief was the pay-as-you-earn, as you can see from the diagram, followed by CIT. VAT was the third one, because the other one was relating to all tax types. So basically, with customs duty coming also in number 5. Those are the major tax types that were granted those reliefs. So the detailed report on the reliefs and the effects are also in the publication that I mentioned. If we look at the reliefs themselves, the frequency of the measures, we see that the extension of filing or payment deadlines was the most prominent one, followed by the issue to enhance business cash flow, and on number 3 was support to health, then followed by enhancement of business continuity. Again, all the details and explanations are in the report that I've mentioned. So these were the non-tax relief measures that were provided. In total, there were 121, which were reported by our 23 countries that I have mentioned. We categorized them into three groups. Those that were relating to maintenance of health, which included social distancing measures, partial or to full lockdown, mandatory protective wearing of protective gear, and closure of borders, and also suspension of social gatherings. Even some of the church gatherings were also suspended. Then the other group related to the support that was given to business, and this included agricultural business loan schemes, industrial support from other countries, which include introduction of bank loan repayment schemes, and then the others related to the support that were given directly to the households. What did we, in summary, what did we find from our survey on the business continuity? We found out that 75% of the respondents, they indicated that they had a business continuity plan in place. And 20% of the responses, they said they had no business continuity plan, while this 5% were not sure, they were not aware. 60% confirmed that the business continuity plan was being implemented, while 30% said they had the plan in place, but it was not being implemented. And among the reasons for not implementing included the lack of resources, and also the fact that it was not just a priority in some of the tax administrations. Here, in general, our findings are relating to the customs revenue. I think if you look closely, we've got 2 lines here. We've got we've got this orange line and the blue line. So what it basically is saying, we had data from December 2018 up to April 2010, April 2020, where we looked at the trends, having forecasted or projected what was supposed to be the revenue inflow if we had not this challenge of COVID-19 pandemic. You see the orange line is above the blue line. So the effect or the impact that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, it becomes so prominent if you look from February. From February, you see it's below the orange line right up to April, where we did our analysis, the period that we did the analysis, and you see that the fall in revenue is very prominent in April. But much of the description or discussion also related to this, we will find it in the report. So from the customs analysis, our initial results indicated that for the 3 month period from February to April, the 18 countries that we worked with, they lost revenue that amounts to between US 400 up to 500 million. And we then looked at the impact in the African continent as a whole. We realized that if we use the same revenue loss factor for the 18 countries, we realized that if we factor it accordingly, out of the 54 countries in Africa, the loss would be above 1 billion only in customs revenue for 3 months, which implies that for the year, African countries would have lost revenue that is more than 3 billion USD. So what are some of our conclusions? We see from this analysis that global pandemics have serious negative effects on tax revenues. We also have mentioned that there is a twin challenge which has been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, where the tax administrations are in a dilemma. They have to raise revenue for government. At the same time, they have to provide relief by foregoing some of the revenue through tax expenditures or tax relief measures. And also, we also realize that some countries are granted tax relief measures without placing caps. This is what we discovered even in the survey. The countries that granted the tax relief measures or the expenditures without putting or placing caps or even sunset clauses. So it will become difficult to track these expenditures. We also conclude that regarding customs revenue, it is estimated that those 18 country ATAF members that we have mentioned, they lost close to 500 million USD in 3 months. What are some of the recommendations that we are giving to policymakers, to tax administrations, to development partners? So we are saying to the policymaker, now that the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in big challenges, the original targets that the tax administration have already been given, the policymaker should consider reviewing them in line of the developments due to the current pandemic. The other issue is that we also need now to focus on those revenue streams that were not fully explored. For example, we have taxation of high net worth individual. So we have to now look at it because it's some of the revenue stream that had not been fully explored. We have even property taxes, tax administrations, although some of them do not have a direct effect on the management of property taxes. But we are saying to policymakers, these are some of the taxes that should be considered because they are not yet fully explode and they have a potential to raise more revenue. Another recommendation is that we need to modernize our ICT systems because the COVID-19 pandemic has called for an increased use in technology. Look, even this webinar that we are attending, it requires technology. So we are saying policymakers, governments throughout Africa or throughout the world should consider modernizing the ICT system because they will get more revenue from modernized ICT system. I have alluded to the fact that these incentives or tax expenditures were given without placing caps. So we are encouraging the placement of caps and sunset clauses on those tax relief measures that have been provided. Also, we are recommending that there should be in tax administrations teams and even Ministry of Finance teams that should be put in place to monitor and evaluate the impact and effects of these measures that have been provided. In addition, government should consider increasing funding to tax administrations. So besides reviewing the revenue targets, we are recommending that the tax administrations be funded well so that they are able to do more, especially under these stressful conditions. Regarding non-tax relief measures, we have also realized that there were also some expenditures that were provided without even caps again, and sometimes there's no tracking of those expenditures. We are recommending that we should consider tracking those expenditures, and also related to the lockdown, we are recommending that authorization, maybe countries would consider authorizing travel based on substantive reasons. This could include seeking for medical treatment. This could include education and the like. And in considering that, countries could also consider a phased down approach, like what is happening already in some countries, consider a phased down approach in easing the lockdown restrictions. The major challenge that we have seen also is that the informal sector has been the one that has been hard hit. So we are recommending that close attention be paid to this informal sector. They should be given the platform to express their views, because we understand that our African countries, they have a huge informal sector, so we cannot ignore the informal sector. Recommendations related to ERM, enterprise risk management, tax fraud, and business continuity. Regarding ERM, we are recommending that we should consider setting up risk management committees at corporate level and put in place disaster recovery plans. We discovered from the survey that we carried out with our members that some, they do not have a business continuity plan, some do not have a disaster recovery plan, some they do not even have the framework of risk management. So this is the recommendation that they should consider setting up these committees in place. The sooner the better. Then related to the fraud issues, because of COVID-19 and all these relief measures that have granted, or fraudsters will also take advantage and defraud revenue authorities. So we are recommending that tax administration should leverage on ICT to register and track the beneficiaries of these measures. They should also implement punitive fines to deter offenders, and in addition, they should criminalize the tax offenses. However, there is also a great need for education campaigns to be run throughout the nation for both taxpayers and staff. And key among also the anti-fraud measures would be to guard against the ICT systems and the data of the Revenue Authority. With regard to the BCPs, we said those countries which are not implementing them should consider implementing the BCPs, and also encourage them to encourage their taxpayers to use digital channels and also to invest in robust ICT systems or ICT platforms. Because currently in many tax administration staff are working from home, we're encouraging that the offices, until such a time that it is safe, maybe not more than 50% of the staff should be operating in the office, and so there is need for implementation of staff rotations. With regard to customs revenue, the recommendation is to consider intensifying post-clearance audits. There's also need for the Revenue Authority to put in place systems to curb smuggling activities, because we have realized that during the COVID period, there's been a number of reports related to smuggling, especially of tobacco or cigarettes. Revenue authorities should also consider adopting risk management practices. It is critical that they do that. In addition, they should increase the inter and intra-agents cooperation between customs and other government departments. There's also need for those countries where the domestic taxes is not interlinked to the customs, to consider also sharing information. Exchange of information will be critical under such circumstances. And not only within the same country, but we are encouraging that even to go beyond borders. There is need for customs administrations, tax administrations to share information among themselves. And this is critical because it will help deter this issue of fraud, especially from the MNEs, multinational corporation. So yeah, with this, I think you can stop here and say most of the stuff you'll find it in the report that I have mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ezra, for those remarks and for presenting the results from your latest report and from the surveys that you've carried out. And I was particularly struck by the framing of the issue, the twin challenge of how to mobilize revenues while at the same time providing support to countries and to businesses. And so I think the recommendations that you presented provide some very practical steps for countries to undertake in doing this. I was also struck by some of the numbers you cited in terms of customs revenues, and there's some fairly scary numbers. It will be a good link to the next presentation, which is by Alexander Pick, fiscal economist at the OECD Development Centre, who will discuss the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement on public revenues. So I will hand over to Alex.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just loading up my screen. Sometimes this takes a little bit of time, but okay, we're here now. Well, first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's attending this this webinar today, and to everyone who's been involved in setting it up. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar names, if unfortunately not so many familiar faces. But I do hope, as Michelle says, that we will see each other in due course. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement on public revenues. This is in large part based on a special feature that the OECD wrote in strong collaboration with the African Union Commission for the 2019 report. For the sake of, due to time constraints, I won't talk perhaps for as long as I would like on the importance of the AFCFTA for Africa's development as a whole. But I think it's important that we should acknowledge the ambition and the importance of this initiative. In terms of creating a single market for goods and services and facilitating the movement of people to promote economic integration across the continent. as a whole. This is really a cornerstone of the Vision 2063 and is critical to Africa's long-term development, as we'll see. The AFCTA, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of an alphabet soup there. The agreement took effect in May 2019, and the operational phase began shortly afterwards. As the idea was that trading under the new agreement would start in July 2020, but unfortunately, because of coronavirus, this has been pushed back, hopefully only to January of next year. 54 countries out of 55 have signed the AFCTA agreement, and 30 have ratified, although perhaps only 28, depending on how one defines ratified. But the important thing is that well over half the countries in the African continent have indeed ratified it. So the objective is to remove tariff and non-tariff barriers on trade within the region over a period of 10 years, with least developed countries having 13 years to make this transition rather than 10. And overall, when we talk about public revenues, we expect this to be a game changer in a positive way. The free trade agreement is expected to unlock significant economic growth, and with that drive increases in revenues. But at the same time, we must acknowledge that trade taxes, and this is the subject of today, are an important part of Africa's revenue mix, and so it'll be helpful to use this presentation to understand perhaps a little bit about what the impact in the short term on public revenues will be in the region. So just very quickly, some striking numbers about the low level of intra-African trade at the moment. Only 15.5% of Africa's total trade was within the region in 2017, which is actually below where it was in 2011 and far lower than the case in the European Union, where it is 67% of total trade is within the region. An often overlooked point is that boosting intra-African trade is also important to diversifying production away from commodities. Primary goods were 62% of exports in 2017. Tariffs and non-tariff barriers are important, and non-tariff barriers aren't the subject of this special feature, but are an important thing perhaps to look into on the outside of this. And another point to make at this point is that intra-regional trade isn't always formal. It's not always picked up in trade statistics. And where this trade is informal, it will be harder to predict what will be the impact of the AFCTA on this aspect of African trade. Another important point, which we'll come back to, is that this overarching continental agreement will build on the successes of regional economic communities in liberalizing trade. The idea is very much to build on and go as far as, if not further than, what has already been achieved by different regions that we'll look at in a second. At the same time as avoiding fragmentation, so bringing the continent as a whole to avoid the case of having just individual regional agreements which don't necessarily talk to each other. And finally, an important point to make before we start is how coronavirus has exposed the need for this, not in terms of necessarily long-term economic growth, but actually in addressing the crisis itself. So trade barriers have impeded the flow of essential goods needed to help fight the pandemic. And I know that the African Union Commission and others are working hard to address this constraint. So how can revenue statistics in Africa help? Well, we collect obviously in conjunction with our partner countries, data on trade taxes, which is then harmonized according to three main categories. These are customs and import duties, which is classified as 5, 1, 2, 3, taxes on exports, and finally other taxes on international trade and transactions. We also pick up receipts from within the Southern African Customs Union. For the 2019 report, we had data from Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and South Africa. Actually, I'm not sure That's right. But in any case, these are non-tax revenues rather than tax revenues. Finally, we also have there are 93 country-specific tax classifications which we also compile, which relate to trade taxes. So if we look at the importance of trade taxes in 2017, we see that excluding SACU countries, revenues from trade taxes averaged 13.1% of total tax revenues. Indeed, they exceeded 20% in Côte d'Ivoire, Mauritania, and Togo and Uganda. We also see that the trend of trade taxes as a percentage of total tax revenues is broadly one of decline. So they fell in 19 out of 23 non-SACU countries between 2008 and 2017. And as we know from the presentation we've already seen, tax to GDP ratios increased over that period across the region as a whole, which obviously means that the loss of the relative decline of tax revenues from trade taxes was more than offset by increases in other categories of public revenues, which is obviously a good sign when we think about the impact of the AFCTA. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you what these look like graphically. And so we see across the 23 countries, the non-SACU countries, we see the overall this decline between 2008 and 2017, with just a few outliers where trade taxes account for in excess of 20% of revenues. But at the same time, it's important to note that actually in 12 other countries, they account for between 10 and 20% of total revenue. So that is a significant amount. Despite this decline, these trade taxes still contribute an important part, or are still an important part of the revenue mix. It's also striking that these tend to be the countries that are at lower income levels. We've seen particularly dramatic falls in Seychelles and also in Democratic Republic of Congo. But at the same time, there have been increases in notably in Mauritania, which where the level is high and was high and has got higher, and also in Equatorial Guinea, where there's been a substantial jump, albeit from a low base, and in Mali as well, where there's been a small increase in the proportion of tax revenues from trade taxes. And finally, although we didn't have data from 2008 for Nigeria, we did have it for 2010, and Nigeria too has registered a small increase in the importance of revenues from trade taxes. Now, we talk a lot as well in revenue statistics about the trade taxes as a percentage of GDP. One striking point here is that on average, trade tax revenues from trade taxes are equivalent were equivalent to 2.1% of GDP in 2017. This is only slightly down from the level in 2008, where it was 2.2%. So there has been a decline as a proportion of revenues, but actually it's been relatively constant as a proportion of GDP. And that is still 2%. It's still a significant hit. You take away that 2%, countries are really going to feel it. Also striking is that, yes, there has been a decline in 13 countries, 13 of the non-SACU countries in trade tax as a percentage of GDP, but they have actually increased in 9. So it's not necessarily just to say there has been a decline overall, shouldn't mask the fact that this is not necessarily a trend without its complexities and its nuances. So one very helpful thing that revenue statistics is able to show is the impact of other regional trade agreements over the last 20 years or so. So we've drawn attention to 3, one of which, the West African Economic and Monetary Union, was actually signed before a date for which we have data. But nonetheless, we've been able to track the impact from between 2000 and 2017. And we see quite a varied picture. So a sharp decline in Niger in terms of the proportion of trade taxes as a proportion of total tax revenues. but also declines in Mali and in Togo and Burkina Faso and Senegal. Although it's striking actually that in Côte d'Ivoire, they increased as a percentage of total revenues over this period. The East African Community, meanwhile, is a customs union was established in 2005, and there have been significant declines across the region, 6.3% in Rwanda, 2.5% in Kenya. And then the Agadir Agreement in North Africa has also prompted declines. Now, one thing that I haven't shown here, because it gets a bit complicated, but is how other types of tax have responded over the same period. And what we see is quite a mixed picture. We haven't seen one type of tax that suddenly has increased substantially to offset. It varies by country, and clearly it varies according to the way countries have responded to the change in tax structure or to the difference in their revenue makeup. So we can't necessarily infer from this data what types of tax will suddenly increase once the AFCTA is established. So just some final thoughts. It's easy to forget how important the Continental Free Trade Agreement is, not only in and of itself, but also in what it represents at a context, in a situation where the multilateral trading system is perhaps attempting to reinvent itself, and there's a push towards protectionism in some quarters. Here we have 55 countries, or 54 countries, pushing in very much the same direction. And this is something, obviously, that warrants our considerable admiration and support. At the same time, we've seen that Africa has been progressively less reliant on revenues from trade taxes, in part since the 1990s, in part due to these trade agreements that we've seen elsewhere. And that helps it makes the transition to the new agreement easier. At the same time, trade taxes do remain an important source of public revenues for the most countries, especially those at the lowest income. So in all the 10 least developed countries that we cover in RevStats in Africa, trade taxes over total tax revenues exceed the regional average. So this means that the flexibilities envisaged under the AFCFTA are likely to be very important in supporting these countries to adapt to the new system, especially where revenues are so scarce in the context of the SDGs, and also the coronavirus, or in the aftermath of the coronavirus as well. Of course, there's the opportunity as well that countries can adapt their tax systems to reflect what's coming, and to better deal with any shortfalls in revenues. And this is an effort that can be supported, again, using the resources of everyone on this call today, for a start. And lastly, I just want to say that Revenue Statistics in Africa will continue to monitor the impact of AFCFTA on public revenues over the short and long term, as indeed the agreement takes effect. That's all from me. Thank you very much. And yeah, any questions will be hopefully answered shortly. Just let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that presentation on the African Free Trade Agreement, and for the consequences for that in terms of trade revenues that we will be able to follow with revenue statistics. So next, I will turn the floor to Talita Yamashiro-Fortaloni, an advisor at the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD, who will present more information on the preparations for the 2020 edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa. Thank you, Talita.
Thank you, Michelle. Trying to share my screen. I hope this works out. Yes. Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon to all participants. It's really a pleasure to have you all here. This is the last round of comments, and I promise that will be very fast so we can have some time to discuss during the questions and answers. So I'll provide some comments on the next steps to preparing the 2020 edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa, and discuss very briefly how this initiative supports African countries to better track and understand domestic resource mobilization in the continent. It was quite interesting to hear the main presentation and the comments by the AUC, ATAF, and OECD that followed. And what transpires is that domestic resource mobilization has reached a crossroad, in a sense, in the continent. There has been undeniable overall progress on average, as we have seen on tax to GDP ratio, but the average tax to GDP ratio in Africa has reached a plateau since 2015. And now with the coronavirus pandemic, there is a risk that the progress achieved so far will be hindered. But there are also opportunities, as Alexander Pick has just mentioned, for countries to reorient their tax systems to support more domestic resource mobilization. One of the opportunities is as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is implemented. So where does revenue statistics in Africa fit into all that? Revenue statistics in Africa provide high quality data on tax revenues, and this plays a key role in domestic resource mobilization because it can illustrate the impact of different factors on domestic resource mobilization and on the resilience of fiscal systems. Also, it can inform evidence-based policymaking to scale up revenues in the continent in a sustainable and inclusive way. And when we talk about high quality data, just to be clear, we're talking about data that is accurate, that is comprehensive, accessible, and fit for purpose. So revenue statistics in Africa, as you may have understood already, provide some key indicators for evidence-based tax reform. The data on tax to GDP ratios and tax structure, they help answering key questions such as what is the overall tax revenue in your country, the overall level of tax revenue in your country, how does it compare to other countries, how much revenue does your country raise from different taxes, and how does your country tax structure, what does it imply about the sustainability and progressivity of your tax system? It also helps to answer how does your country tax structure compare to other countries with similar level of taxation or income. Oh, I can see that maybe my video is not on. Oh, okay. And also helps answering how have revenues changed over time. Answering what have been the impacts of economic shocks on tax revenues and which taxes have been most affected and how quickly have revenues rebounded and why. It also helps illustrating what are the revenue effects of tax reforms. So we have already completed data collection for this year's edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa. We'll present key revenue indicators for around 30 African countries. The next steps will be to prepare the country revenue data tables. This data is collected together with participating countries and is validated by participating countries. So no data is published in our publication before countries validate and see it. In July and August, we'll prepare the comparative cross-country indicators and comparative charts for the publication. In September, we'll prepare the analysis on revenue trends and on the special feature. And the special feature, just to clarify, it's a chapter that we always have in revenue statistics publication where we link revenue statistics in Africa data with a specific policy issue. In this year, very likely we'll do a special feature on coronavirus. Then we'll prepare the publication and all its material for launch in end of October, early November. So as we mentioned, we will have 30 countries participating in this year's edition, but all African countries are certainly welcome to join future editions of the publication. There is no financial cost to participate, and there is only minimal resource cost. And this resource cost essentially means one person, a focal point, maybe two in your country, who will collaborate with the partners to produce the data and engage in some activities. So we estimate that it shouldn't take more than 1 week of someone's time over a year. Your country just needs to confirm the willingness to participate, typically in a letter from your minister or from your high-level official to the OECD, AUC, and ATAF. And as mentioned, your country would have to designate a focal point who will work with us to collect and harmonize the data. This focal point should be authorized to access the aggregate data from the various departments, agencies, and levels of government that may hold the data that is required to produce the publication. And the focal point will also work in partnership with the OECD, AUC, ATAF to align your country's revenue data with the OECD classification, validated and presented in the publication. So if you like more information, I'll leave it here, the webpage for Revenue Statistics in Africa, and also our email address. So all the presentations will be available in a dedicated webpage, and we'll share the link with you so you can contact us and review all the information that was presented today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talita. So before we start the questions and answers session, I'll invite Gaëlle d'Orléans from the European Commission to provide some short remarks on the Pan-African Statistics Programme. Thank you, Gaëlle.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for giving me an opportunity to make a few comments on this. Well, first of all, I mean, I speak for DEFCO in the EU. We've been supporting the revenue statistics report from the beginning of this initiative, and we welcome very much this webinar to advance on this important subject, despite the difficult times we find ourselves at the moment. And actually, I mean, all of the speakers, the presenters today showed really well how these times require even more than ever that tax policies and tax administrations that can adapt to the current challenges. And so just on our side to explain a little bit how this fits into a broader context for the European Union, our support to this initiative is part of a larger approach which we call Collect More, Spend Better. So supporting partner countries in their efforts to mobilize more domestic revenues and use financial resources more effectively. This is also links up with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Development and the Addis Ababa Tax Initiative. This can also be seen in our commitment to fighting illicit financial flows. We've been working closely supporting the African Union Commission in this context. And we can also put it in a broader context of the support that the EU provides to strengthening the African statistical system as a whole, to ensure the use of quality statistical data in the African integration decision-making process and policy monitoring. Because we see that integration triggers a strong need for statistical data, not only at national level, but also at regional and at continental level. And we've been supporting that with the, we've been supporting the African statistical system in improving the availability, comparability, and dissemination of quality statistics with the Pan-African Statistics Program that we've been implementing together with the African Union Commission. So, and this work on revenue statistics will be actually in the near future integrated into this broader statistics program. And finally, we very much welcome also the work on specifically on the monitoring of the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area on public revenues. So on the short-term and long-term periods, this is for us a very important aspect of the work that we're very keen on supporting, as supporting the African Continental Trade Area process is also, is a flagship initiative of the African Union Commission that we've been supporting and that we will continue supporting in the future. That's all. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Gail, for these remarks and for the information on the Pan-African Statistics Program as well. So we'll turn now to the questions and answers session of the discussion. We've received several questions via the function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar, and you're welcome to continue to submit questions. We have around 10 minutes left in the official scheduled time, but we will be able to run over a little, so we'll try to answer as many questions as we can over the next 20 minutes or so. I'll start with the question, a more general question to the panel from Namibia, which looks at the trends in tax revenues in Africa over the last 3 years or so, given that, as Emmanuel and Ione showed, they have stayed relatively constant since then at just over 17%. So there are two questions from Namibia. Firstly, what are the major causes of the stagnation in the tax to GDP ratio in Africa? And the second question is, how can tax jurisdictions in Africa improve their tax to GDP ratios? So I will hand the question first to ATAF, to Nara and Isra, and then to the African Union, followed by the OECD. Nara or Isra, would you like to reply?
I'll start, Michelle, thank you. What we've seen, as you, thank you again to all the presenters and again to all the participants as well for their very interesting questions there. On the ATO side, as you know, we are currently on the 2020 edition. We are covering 37 African countries, so we have statistics for those countries. And you will have seen as well, Edie, that as we go along, as we adding more countries, and sometimes countries that have less, that are not as the same with the same level of development as the others, we see that on average the tax to GDP ratio is decreasing. At least that's one of the main explanations that we have on the ATO. That's just on average, and obviously, of course, we have on the ATO we have also trying to start classifying the countries that have good. That are performing well compared to the countries that are not performing as well in terms of the tax to GDP ratio, so that we can start advancing what are the good practices on the good performers that the least performers can basically learn from. But on average, just a fast explanation for now is just that as we increase over the years, the tax to GDP ratio is basically, we see stagnant or a little bit decreasing on the case of the ATO. I am assuming that's something that we can also see on the revenue statistic part. But I will invite also the OECD colleagues to see what they can add there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nara. Before we turn to the OECD colleagues, Indinai or Dulcina, do you have any comments on the question?
Dulcina, do you want to take that question? I think it's set up. Maybe he's not around. Yes, but I think
Mr. Dulcina is not around. So we can address the question to another person.
So yeah, if Indinai can reply. I'm around, but I'm running for another meeting with the commission.
Okay.
So Indinai, please.
Okay, yes. I mean, I think basically, I think it's the large informal sector that doesn't contribute to tax. So the formal companies or formal employees that are able to pay taxes, the numbers are not growing, so we will not see taxation growing in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I'll now turn the question to my OECD colleagues. Would Emmanuel, Talita, or Alex like to reply to this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. So yes, the tax to GDP ratio, we need to think about them. They're influenced by a variety of different factors. there are macroeconomic characteristics like the diversification of an economy, a resource endowment, openness to trade. As it was mentioned, the size of the informal economy can influence the tax to GDP ratio, but also the capacity of tax administration, the level of corruption and tax morale. So all of these factors have an impact on tax to GDP ratio. Now, to look at the trend, I think it's important, as Nara has mentioned, that the tax revenue in Africa has increased since 2010 by 1.9 percentage points. So I think that's a very good news, that even though it has remained unchanged for the last 3 years. What we can say from the last 3 years, I think I would say there are also different factors. Some economic factors, and as we have seen for the Republic of Congo, we've seen that there are some, because of the economic downturn, we've got a decrease between the 2016 and 2017, and we need to remember in the last few years as well there was a decrease on oil prices that have affected also the tax revenue on few countries. So for the question about what type of revenues African countries should increase, I would say when you compare the African countries with other regions, the thing which is very striking is low level of personal income tax and social security contribution that they have a scope to be increased, but also as ATAF has mentioned in their presentation, the African countries should focus on revenue streams that are not fully explored, like property taxes and environmental related tax revenue. I think there are also some good type of revenue that African countries should consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. We touched on the influence of the informal sector in some African countries in limiting the ability to raise revenues. And there's been another question on the informal sector and how it's been affected by the COVID crisis, noting that in many countries, the informal sector has been hit particularly hard by the pandemic. So the question is, what are the potential measures of relief for the informal sector for the coronavirus participation? For the coronavirus pandemic. I'll hand this question to Ezra.
Thank you, Michelle. So basically, the first issue is to give them a platform to air out their views, because we can't provide solutions to them without involving them. So that is the major recommendation from the International Labour Organization, to say we should give them a platform to air out their views, to tell us what they require, and then we give them the solutions based on their needs. But one issue, if you look from our survey, that Mauritius is doing, they are assisting the informal sectors through what they call authorized employment generating activities. Although at the same time taking into consideration the issue of health, the issue of social distancing, but this is helping them because at least they have self-employment generating activities through the support of the government. And basically the other issue relates now to education, because we should run massive education campaigns, maybe through posters, maybe through radio spots, maybe through text messages, just to educate them on various ways that they can survive under these circumstances. Thank you.
Can I also say something? Yes, I think,
Yes,
yeah, the first thing that we noted is that when these lockdowns were effected across the continent, the informal sector was largely affected and negatively impacted. and there was an immediate loss of income to them. So I think with the stimulus packages that were being rolled out, or well, the pandemic continues, so there should be food and income packages to those people in the informal sector. And to do that, you need to identify who they are. So there should be a register for them, and they should be assured that they will not be punished for being informal. I think most of them really do not want to come out because they think they'll be made to pay taxes. So in the short term, we should identify who they are and then provide the short-term relief. But going forward, I think when you have registered them, we should also be able to provide some sort of income for them, for their businesses to continue, because most of them are going to be to stop functioning because they will not be able to continue after the pandemic. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. So we have also received a few specific questions for participants, and some have already been answered, but there's one from Lesotho on why Lesotho is not currently included in the publication. So I'll ask Talita to respond to that question, please.
Thank you, Michelle. So yes, so we've been working with Lesotho to collect your statistics for inclusion in our publication. So the presentation that was done earlier on by Emmanuel and Leonie was based on the 2019 edition, which did not count yet with Lesotho because we hadn't yet collected the data. So for this year's edition, when we launch it in October, it will contain data for Lesotho, also for Chad, for Namibia, and Malawi, which are the 4 countries that are joining this year's edition. Thank you.
Thank you, Talita. So we've received another question from Namibia. This is a more general question, so I will direct it to all of the panelists. Relating to a slide that Emmanuel and Leonie presented earlier on in the presentation, which shows that there are a number of African countries that generate high revenue from taxes on goods and services and comparatively lower amounts from revenue, whether this is because they have a high VAT rate, and on the other side, do they offer higher incentives than normal in terms of income tax? So I will hand this question over to the panel. Can I ask, would Nara perhaps like to reply first? Thank you, Nara.
Yeah. So on our side, and that's again, that's the same thing that we see in the ATO, that basically VAT tends to be the biggest tax handle in Africa anyway, and followed by the PIT and then the CIT. So definitely it's just a first reflection of all the administrative issues. And again, we see that we tend to rely more on VAT on the continent because it's be an easy tax compared to VAT, to PIT and CIT. And of course it reaches almost everybody in the economy, including the informal sector. That's why you see that there's a bigger revenue there compared to PIT again and CIT. Is definitely a problem, as we were saying, as we see we keep on saying that, because it tends to be a regressive tax for us, especially it tends to basically bring a bigger burden on the least on the taxpayers that can least afford it. So that's just a reflection of that. But of course, as well, some of our countries tend to have a high VAT rates compared to the rest. I mean, with countries going up to 18% and more in some countries. And so it's definitely a reflection of the fact that it's an easy tax, but unfortunately also regressive. And it just says that we need to also focus more on increasing the collection on PIT as well as CIT where possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Nara. Emmanuel, would you like to comment on that question as well?
Yeah. So if we look at the tax structure that I have presented, I think the one striking findings that we find is, as Nara said, that African countries are very reliant on revenue from taxes on goods and services, and particularly VAT. But when we look also at the country that rely on income tax, what is really striking is there are two countries that are relying on principally on corporate income tax revenues, mainly from oil, but also there is South Africa, who's have a strong tax administration to collect personal income tax. So again, I think again there is also a different aspect that explain why income tax is lower in many African countries, and depending on the structure and also the diversification of their economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I think we have time for one or two more questions before we will need to close the meeting. So we've received a question from Uganda, two questions really. One about the definition of informal sector and the overlap with the informal sector and small businesses, which can be a difficult line to draw, and making an important point that we do need to be very clear what we're talking about here. And then a second related question about the informal sector, about how we can move to increase their participation in the formal economy or in the tax system to access the informal economy. So I welcome ideas from the panelists on this, and I'll ask ATAF, Ezra and Nara to start.
Okay, so I'll comment briefly, then I'll leave Nara maybe to add. But yes, there's a thin line between informal sector and formal businesses, as Millie says. I just wanted to highlight that for that reason, that's why we are working as ATAF on a guide for the informal sector, so that we guide our tax administration on how to tax it. That will even include what will define as the informal sector according to the fiscal definition that would agree as the tax administrations. Thank you, and I think Nara can add.
Yeah, just to add to that, Millie, just and we are on board on a big project with the AFDB on the efficient taxation of the informal sector in Africa. So we have started a project, and we are actually on the right now developing the big questionnaires that will be sent to all the membership to assist with basically assessing all the challenges, but also the practical solutions that we can put in place in terms of the efficient taxation of the informal sector. Then of course that will include a thorough definition of the informal sector compared to, I don't know, shadow economy, black economy, underground economy, and all that. And also, of course, differentiating with the small and medium businesses as well. So similarly, we also have another big project with the AFDB, as you know, on the ICT systems, because we know that especially this period of COVID, the ICT tax system is becoming absolutely crucial in our tax administrations. So we're also developing a big questionnaires to basically have a big idea around that. So those two projects are going concurrently. And as you know, ICT also has an impact on the informal sector. So those are the things that should be coming up by the end of this year in terms of toolkits or African guidebooks around those two topics. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to comment?
Yes, I think we are talking about the informal sector. And when you talk about the informal sector, these are people who have no legal recognition, I would say. So they have no access to certain benefits that are usually available to people in the formal sector. They have little to no social protection, for instance. So I think those are the people who need to be identified, and they can be found. They just don't want to be found. So they need to be identified so that the right assistance can be availed to them. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Ndinaya. With that, I propose we close the questions for discussion, but if you have any more questions for us, you have our details in the presentations. We will be very happy to reply to you after the event. So in the event today, we have exchanged views on trends in domestic resource mobilization in Africa, looking first at the reasons and the drivers of these trends in the past, including the impact of changes in resource prices, tax policy and administrative reforms, and economic growth. While in recent years, the African average has stayed relatively steady at around 17% of GDP, the tax to GDP ratio for Africa as a whole conceals a wide range of the tax to GDP ratios in Africa that range from less than 10% in 3 countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Nigeria, to over 25% in Morocco, South Africa, Tunisia, and the Seychelles. After looking at trends in the past and also at what happened to revenues in Africa during the global financial crisis, we then looked at 2 of the major events that have the potential to affect revenues in the future, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is affecting us all very strongly at the moment, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. COVID in particular poses particularly difficult challenges for countries in balancing the twin objectives of raising revenues but continuing to support businesses and households. And we heard some practical recommendations from the African Union and from ATAF on how to balance these objectives and discuss briefly the need for different types of responses to target different sectors, particularly the informal sector, as the crisis evolves. To raise more revenue, on the other hand, we heard recommendations to look at tax bases that are currently lesser used in the continent, such as wealth and environmental taxes in particular, as well as property taxes, and also to invest more in revenue administration and in data. The African Union also highlighted the importance of using fiscal policy as part of the response alongside monetary policy, but also on the role of private investment and of support from the international community in driving the recovery in Africa. As Ndinaya said, it's indeed a very critical time for tax policymakers. The COVID crisis will pass, but the decisions that countries are taking now will shape our future in the years to come. A number of speakers also highlighted the need for reliable data to measure and follow the impact of the crisis, and highlighted some of the challenges associated with data collection during the crisis, both in actually gathering the data, but also in the quality of the data in terms of underreporting and accurate categorization. And revenue statistics and the work of the partners on revenue statistics aims to contribute to providing a reliable and comparative source of data for Africa in the future and to contribute part of this reliable evidence base. I would like to thank all of the panelists for their participation in the meeting, as well as all of you who have attended the meeting for your questions and for the discussion that we have had. I will remind you that we will have a video recording of this meeting available, made available on the website after the meeting, and we will also send to you the link to this webpage and to the other revenue statistics in Africa material after the meeting. We also plan to distribute the presentations for those of you who have asked for them in the chat function via the same website. As Talita mentioned, we are now working towards the 2020 edition of Revenue Statistics in Africa, and we aim to be publishing that at the end of October or in early November 2020. We hope that by then we might be able to have a launch event in Africa in person, but if that's not possible, we'll take advantage of platforms like this to have an online launch of the publication and a discussion about its results. Finally, I'd like to invite all countries that are attending today that are not yet participating in the initiative to contact us at the address indicated on the slide for more information about how to join. For future editions of the publication, we would very much welcome your participation. So with that, I would formally close the meeting. Thank you all and have a very nice end of the day.